Welcome, everybody. Hope that everybody's had a good month since last we visited. I want to welcome you here to our second webinar for the 2018 SPC competition. Again, just some heads up as reminders of the format. You are muted. Later on, when there's questions time, if you'd like to ask those out loud, you can unmute yourself, or we can do it on our side. But the easiest way is for you to use the chat button. You can send questions through there, and we will direct those either to our guest speaker or to staff internally, so we make sure we get the right questions. So as this unfolds, feel free to ask those questions. Want to do just a couple housekeeping things as always before we get started and hand it over to our guest speaker for the evening. So first, I want to give you a heads up on a couple things, and I'm going to bounce out of the screen that you see for just a second because I want to show you something in case you haven't been there. If you go to the SPC page that I think each of you are very familiar with at this point, if you go to the CAF data link, if you haven't done that today, you will see there are some updates with a significant amount of information. By the way, when you click on it, it looks slightly different than when I open it up, but that's okay, the same information's there. You'll see there's a number of columns that have been added, roughly 13 columns, starting with the G column or the 12-1 weight column. And these columns are associated with the various growth and gain and conversion parameters, along with the various charges that your calves have incurred over the last month. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those as your schedule allows. I'm going to give you just some brief parameters associated with those. And so as of December 1st, the average weight of the calves in your project is just shy of 800 pounds, as you can see, just shy of 797 pounds. That's an average daily gain on average of a little over 5¼ pounds a day. From an as-fed intake standpoint, your calves are consuming roughly 27 pounds of feed on an as-fed basis per day. If you want to see the dry matter equivalent, you can look at that online. And our as-fed gain or feed conversion is 5.35 pounds of feed to every pound of gain. That's average. Recognize there are calves who are doing better than that, meaning that they're consuming less feed to every pound of gain. In fact, we have a lot of calves that are gaining and converting very well. We have had, since our last visit, a calf or two that's got a little bit sick. And so you can see, if you find those calves, you can see that has certainly impacted their gain and their conversion rate. We'll dig into some of those very specific numbers in an upcoming webinar. So that equates then to average monthly expenses of just shy of $108 per calf. Some of you will see your expenses are a little higher, in particular if you had some medical expenses along the way. Some of you are a little bit cheaper than that. There is a column that says miscellaneous expenses. When you get your bill emailed to you, you will get the details of this. But in case you have questions between now and then, those miscellaneous expenses are bedding. Your calves have been bedded twice. That is your one-time grow safe charge. Again, as a reminder, there's a $25 fee to be on the grow safe. It's a one-time charge. It's on this bill. And then anytime your calves are run through the chute, there's a $2.50 per head processing fee. And so they have been brought through the chute to get their weight. So that was put on this particular bill. So just so you know, that's what's on there. I encourage you to take some time to study through that data with your folks, looking over your shoulders. I think there's a lot in there that you can enjoy mining through and getting some information out. If you have questions from any of that, you let us know. Shoot me an email, shoot any of the team an email, and we can help you work through that. In our last call, I told you that in this particular webinar, I briefly put up the rations that your calves were consuming. And so I wanted to throw them up here right now. Some of you can go back and look at these later when you watch this webinar again tomorrow if you like. But just as a reminder, when those calves first came in prior to 11.5, they were put on a high-quality forage just to kind of let their guts get back to being right after their trip. Again, some of your calves came quite a little ways. Starting at 11.5, they were put on a receiving ration. Again, this ration was to help them acclimate and to keep them healthy and to start to prep them for the rigors ahead. On the 13th of the month, they were then bumped over to a growing ration. And then for 4 days, between the end of November and the 1st of December, they were half and half between a growing ration and a finishing ration. And so that was exactly half and half for both of those. And since that time, at present, those calves are on a finishing ration that is made up of what you see there. Again, we will discuss some of this more in a future webinar, but I told you that I would provide that to you, so I wanted to do that now. As a reminder, you've seen this rubric on your reports. First, thank you to everybody for getting your reports in. I know that the team is very appreciative, and I know that that takes a little time. It was very clear that many of you put a fair amount of effort into those. If I understand correctly, you should have received emails today that actually gave you a breakdown on your first report, so you have that in your pocket or in your email, as it were, before you start working on your second one. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't seen it. Should you not have gotten one, let us know. Shoot us an email yesterday or tomorrow, and we'll see if we can't rectify that. It would have been just an oversight. Now, last thing you're going to hear from me, you should have seen the December newsletter. If not, here's just a couple pieces from it. Huge kudos to Kelsey Stimson for her work on this. I know those of you that were with us last year know that this is a very much improved portion of this competition, to where you're getting a lot of information through that newsletter. There were a couple articles that were written up in there that I think you would appreciate. There's some dates in there. Again, I encourage you to review that. You can do that at the website. But the primary reason I put this up here tonight is twofold. One, to always recognize our sponsors. Chapel Feedlot is still, even though those cattle aren't getting fed there this year, is a huge benefactor of this program and is extraordinarily gracious to be supportive of what you all as young cattle feeders are doing. But probably the most important piece for this being up on the screen is to recognize tonight's guest speaker. Again, we are blessed when we have industry leaders willing to step up and help you all in your position as you're trying to learn and gain more insight. And actually, the first speaker outside of ASA staff that we're going to have in this year's version, and we very specifically wanted her to be our first speaker, is Brandi Karisch, because Dr. Brandi Karisch is very familiar with the spot that you all are in. She was a young Simmental enthusiast herself, a very young Simmental enthusiast at one time. If you read the spotlight on her, and I encourage you to do that, she still is pretty young by my standards, but is risen to the ranks of a professor at Mississippi State University. She's highly regarded throughout the country for the work that she's doing. In particular, a lot of that work is highlighted around successful transition of feeder calves and stocker calves, and so it made great sense that she be our inaugural guest speaker for the 2018 Steer Profitability Competition. So I would encourage you to listen closely. We're going to go ahead and hand the screen off and let her kind of visit with you this evening. I'd encourage you to listen closely, and much of those things that much of those areas of effort and time that you put in to last month's webinar, I'd encourage you to do that, or maybe even more, because I think you're going to learn a lot here over the next little bit that's going to directly impact you as a young cattle feeder. So with that, I'm going to say turn over the screen, if we will, to Brandi and let her handle the rest of this time.
All right, well, I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'll go ahead and get my screen shared. So I am excited to be your kickoff speaker here tonight, and let's see if I can get this technology figured out so I can make sure I see everything that y'all see. So Chip asked me to visit with y'all a little bit about feeder calf health, and I kind of took it a step further and thought it'd be good to visit about at the end some of the things that you can do to give your calves the best chance at feedlot success. So we'll go through a number of different things on the health side, talk a little bit about management practices at home and nutrition practices at home that are going to give those calves the best chance for, let me go ahead and close this just so it doesn't accidentally give us some notifications while we're going through. So trying to give those calves the best chance of success whenever they get to the feed yard. And I commend y'all. I looked through some of the data that Chip mentioned earlier, and I think y'all have done a great job getting those calves set up for success. So jumping right in, I'm sure that most of y'all have probably heard talk about bovine respiratory disease. We refer to it a lot as BRD. So that's the most common and most economically detrimental disease of beef cattle post-weaning. So economic losses continue to persist, and that's a lot of the research area that we're focused on here with our research program at Mississippi State, is looking at improvements in management practices, nutrition, vaccines, and antibiotics that we can do to help these calves overcome bovine respiratory disease. That third bullet, I think, is one to pay attention to, and that's pretty astounding. Estimated annual economic losses from 2013 are in excess of $2 billion. That's a pretty big number that we're leaving on the table when it comes to profit from these calves. Those costs come from both direct and indirect sources. So Chip mentioned you'd see a column if your calf had gotten treated for anything, for treatment costs or processing fees, or if we in fact lost an animal, which I know isn't going to happen for any of y'all, as well as indirect costs in terms of losses in animal performance. So I think Chip did a really good job of laying the foundation for some of these things that we're going to talk about. There we go. So when we say BRD, we refer to a wide range of illnesses. We actually refer to this as the BRD Complex. So a wide range of things kind of related to pneumonia, and it's characterized by many different types of infection and caused by several different viruses and bacteria. Each type of infection has its own causes, clinical signs, and economic implications. It's multifactorial, so that means it's influenced by many different things, and it's influenced by both the host, so that animal itself, as well as environmental factors. So I don't know how the weather is in your part of the country today, but here in Starkville, Mississippi, we started the day at about 68 degrees, and I think we'll end up with a little over 2 inches of rain from this morning, and the temps drop down to the upper 30s tonight. So you can imagine what some of those calves out there in the pasture, wet and cold, might be going through. Also from pathogens, so a lot of the research that we do is actually looking at not necessarily home-raised calves that we're talking about here with the steer profitability competition, but calves that are exposed to pathogens, grouped with other calves, run through the sale barn, those types of things, as well as different management factors that can affect BRD. Like I said before, BRD pathogens are a result of both viral and bacterial factors. So basically, those viruses can act by predisposing the lungs of those animals to a bacterial infection. So basically, the viruses will suppress the defense mechanisms of the respiratory tract of that animal. So some viral pathogens that are involved in the BRD complex, you've probably heard when we talk about vaccinations, IBR, BVD, PI3, BRSV, those are included in many common vaccines. IBR stands for infectious bovine rhinotracheitis. BVD stands for bovine viral diarrhea, and we'll touch on that one a little bit more in detail here in a second. PI3 stands for parainfluenza type 3, and BRSV stands for bovine respiratory syncytial virus. Bacterial pathogens that we see that most commonly can cause BRD are Mannheimia hemolytica, Pasteurella multocida, and Histophilus somni. There's actually some research that we've been finding and discovering here recently that those bacteria will be present at different times of the year. So one might be more present in fall cattle, one might be more present in spring cattle. So a whole host of complex factors. So I said we talk a little bit more in detail about BVD. So BVD can be transmitted via vertical transmission, so that calf can catch BVD while it's still in utero, or horizontal transmission, so one calf can give it to another calf. So the reason that we focus on BVD is because those calves that are infected in utero actually become persistently infected with that virus. So that involves a non-pathogenic strain that occurs between day 42 and 125 while that calf is still gestating in its mama's belly. So I say a lot when I talk about PI calves, those persistently infected animals kind of act like typhoid Mary. So those animals will not necessarily show signs of an infection, but they'll continually shed the virus and infect pen mates. So this is one of the reasons why BVD PI testing has become such a common practice, and it's actually required in a lot of different places. So this is something that we do here on our farm, our research farm here at Mississippi State. So if we see an animal that tests positive for PI, we can pull that animal out of that group so that it doesn't infect and cause increased illness and sickness rates in all of its pen mates. So I told y'all it kind of comes back to dollars and cents. So there's been many studies that have looked at what's the economic impact of BRD, and a lot of times we compare animals that are not treated to animals that are treated 1, 2, or 3 times. So most cases when we get an animal that is treated 3 or more times, we call that animal chronically ill, and it's handled a little bit differently than we would that animal that's never been treated or been treated 2 times. So those cattle that receive treatments for BRD just 1 time returned $40 less than those calves that stayed healthy. 2 times we bumped that up to $58, and then we had a pretty big jump to those calves that were treated 3 times or more at $291, so almost $300 less than non-treated animals that we saw in returns for those animals. A big portion, so almost 80% of that lost return in that study was due to decreased carcass weights and reduced quality grades rather than just treatment costs. So I talked about direct versus indirect costs there at the beginning. So those indirect costs actually played a big portion in what's causing those lost returns. But that's not always necessarily the case. So Chip mentioned we had probably some compensatory gains on some of the steers on our calves on the project. So I was going to show y'all some results from a study that we performed several years back here in Starkville. So we were looking at the stalker phase for those cattle that are transitioning from the farm onto grass and then onto the feed yard. So we looked at the effects of crude protein levels in those calves receiving diets, and then metaphylaxis. So that metaphylaxis is mass treatment on arrival on the health, growth, and performance of newly received stalker calves. And then we followed a subset of these calves through the feed yard. And the reason that I'm showing y'all this study is it's kind of an extreme case. So the health outcomes were pretty severe. And so I'll caution this in with a grain of salt. So when we do these research projects, this is probably the only time that we want cattle to get sick. So if cattle stay healthy, it's hard for us to figure out why they get sick. So we took these calves and kind of put them in an extreme scenario. So we sourced calves from sale barns all over the southeast. They were semi-lightweight, so between 400 and 500 pounds whenever we got them in, and then we commingled them. We stuck them all in a group together, we worked them all, and then kicked them out in pens of 12 cattle apiece in those pens. So we treated 176 calves over the course of this study. So that meant that we had 72% of these calves got sick, and we had 13% of these calves that died. So this is an extreme scenario, and that's why I'm showing y'all this. So as you can imagine, those calves that got sick, we saw a pretty big reduction in terms of gain and performance during the stocker phase. So the times those cattle were growing out and getting prepared to go to the feed yard. So the focus of the study is not necessarily that mass treatment, but I wanted to show y'all some of the results. So those cattle that received that mass treatment on arrival were 60% less likely to be diagnosed with BRD. So that mass treatment on arrival in this group of high-risk calves worked really well. So this is something that I think is really important. So for every little over 100 pounds that those calves were heavier at arrival, they were 45% less likely to get sick. So that's something that I think is really key. The more we can get those calves a little bit bigger coming into the feed yard, the more likely they are to stay healthy. So we didn't see any interactions with our diet, with our crude protein levels, or our metaphylaxis associated with risk for mortality. So the second part of this project, after we followed them through that stocker phase where these cattle got really sick, we pulled 76 heads, so enough to fill a feed yard pen, and we sent them to the Tri-County Steer Carcass Futurity group there in Lewis, Iowa. So that group works closely with Iowa State University, and it's one that we've worked with for several years to send cattle to collect feed yard information. So we pulled 19 head per each one of those stocker treatments that I talked to you about previously. So one thing that's unique here is that we finished these cattle to a target endpoint. So a target of 1 centimeter or about ½ an inch of back fat, and we harvested these cattle in 2 groups. Then we also looked at lungs when those cattle were harvested to see if there were any active or resolved cases of pneumonia. So no matter how good we might be at going out and deciding which cattle are sick and pulling them and treating them, research has continually shown that some cattle we're just not going to be able to tell that they're sick, and we might miss some of them, and that's where those lung lesions come into play. So if we looked at it just purely from a BRD diagnosis during the stocker phase, so if they got sick before they got to the feed yard, and then they got to the feed yard, and I'll mention that of those 76 head that made it to this feed yard phase, I think we only treated 2 animals the entire time that they were on feed. So these animals, you can think about it, they got sick early and then kind of knocked it out of them when they kicked things off. So the ones that got sick early on actually gained a little bit more whenever they got to the feed yard. So that's something that we attribute a little bit to compensatory gain. So those cattle, got sick early on in that backgrounding phase, in that stocker phase, and then when we sent them to the feed yard, we kind of straightened them out, and those cattle were ready to grow and perform, and actually caught up to and passed their counterpart in terms of average daily gain and final body weight. So these calves were consistent. They didn't really knock things out of the park in terms of gain like y'all's calves are doing right now. So if we talk about it in terms of carcass performance, you'll notice these cattle were fed to essentially an eyeball test of fat thickness. So about 4 to 5/10 an inch of fat is what we were targeting, and those guys did a really good job projecting those cattle to this point. You'll notice the cattle that were sick during the stocker phase actually had a little bit heavier hot carcass weight and a little bit more fat thickness compared to those cattle that did not get sick during the stocker phase. No differences in marbling and no differences in ribeye area. So this is something that was really interesting whenever we started analyzing these things, especially when we think about it from the standpoint of these cattle got sick early on and then we sent them to the feed yard. So the reason that I bring this up is that's why the backgrounding phase is so important, is we got those cattle prepared to thrive whenever they got to the feed yard. So those first little bit of time when those cattle get started on the feed and get to the feed yard is something that's really key. And that's where a lot of that lost performance and lost revenue that I mentioned early on is going to start with. So what can you do in terms of management and nutrition strategies to make sure that those calves are ready to thrive? So I mentioned a lot of the research and a lot of the work that we do is actually during the backgrounding phase. So I neglected to tell y'all in the beginning, my training and my background is actually in nutrition. So of course I'm going to say that's always the most important thing we can do is do a good job of feeding and providing good nutrition to these cattle during the backgrounding phase. So our goal during that backgrounding phase or preconditioning phase is to add value to these cattle by adding weight. But the big problem that we faced is we wean those calves off, and a lot of times they're small. They're probably stressed. Even if they never left the farm, weaning is a stressful situation. Even if we try to do the best job of low stress handling and low stress weaning practices, that's just a stressful time in that calf's life. So getting that nutrition into those cattle initially is something that's really difficult to do. So without a good backgrounding plan, those cattle can actually go backwards. And that's something that we don't want to see. We want to see them going forward when it comes time for them to hit the feed yard. So I wanted to show y'all something that came out of our research station there close to Jackson, Mississippi. So we've got some growth safe bunks similar to what your cattle are on there in Missouri. And we actually looked at 2 pens of cattle. So we took these cattle and put them in the most extreme situation that we could think of. These cattle had not been creep fed. They'd never been exposed to grain. We pulled them off their mamas and stuck them in a dry lot where they had to learn how to eat out of a feed bunk. And y'all can see that's a pretty stark contrast. So on the left-hand side of the screen going up that axis is our feed intake in pounds. So that's how much feed those cattle were eating. And then on the bottom side is the days post-weaning. So you can see it was up until about day 9, between day 8 and day 9, when those cattle hit 5 pounds of intake. You know, Chip just told y'all that your cattle there at the feed yard were eating close to 30 pounds of feed a day. These calves, a week in, weren't even eating 5 pounds of feed per day. So that's something that was really interesting for us to be able to see. And then, because we had that growth safe facility, we were actually able to see how many of those cattle were sticking their head in the bunk to eat. So I mentioned those cattle had never seen a feed bunk and they had never been exposed to grain. And it took those cattle almost a week before they were consistently going in, sticking their head in the feed bunk and consuming meals. So that's a long time for those cattle to start going backwards where they're not getting any nutrition into them. So we plan our backgrounding programs and our weaning nutrition programs kind of around this idea. So if we think about it in terms of nutrient requirements, so the National Research Council every few years, we actually had a recent one that came out. We'll go through, and they're the ones that tell us essentially how much those cattle need to eat to gain a certain amount. So if y'all notice on the right-hand side of this chart, those are the numbers we really care about. So pounds of protein, pounds of energy that calf needs to eat per day to gain anywhere from a half a pound to 3 pounds. So if we've got a 500-pound steer and we want him to gain 3 pounds a day during that backgrounding period, he needs to eat 2 pounds of protein per day and almost 10% energy per day, 10% TDN per day. So we predict that that calf's going to eat about 12 pounds of feed per day if we're maxing out his intake. And you can see that crude protein requirement and that energy requirement for that feed is pretty high. But what if that calf doesn't eat 12 pounds of feed per day? We've got to make his diet a little bit more nutrient dense to get that energy and get that protein into him. So I talked a lot about preconditioning programs, and I think this is the bread and butter of getting your calves ready to thrive in the feed yard. So the goal of a good preconditioning program is to create weaned, properly immunized calves that are ready to perform well when they get to the next phase of life. So I noticed I didn't just say that they needed to be weaned. I said we wanted them to be vaccinated and to have time to develop immunity. So we'll talk about that a little bit more here later on. So management strategies are a big part of most preconditioning programs. So they include dehorning and castrating at a young age instead of near weaning, so we're not compounding those stresses on those animals. Minimizing weaning stress. So stressed calves aren't going to come up to the bunk and eat. They're not going to gain weight, and they're more likely to get sick. Getting those calves started on feed and water rapidly is something that's really important. Most of the time, if you're selling calves or you're shipping them to the feed yard, they're going to want them to be at least 45 days weaned. And a lot of the buyers that I've been talking to lately have been saying that those guys want those calves to be at least 60 days weaned. So if you think about it, we're in kind of a transition time of year where those calves, particularly if they're coming from an area that hadn't had a whole lot of wet and cold yet, they're going through some pretty extreme environmental stressors. So we want to make sure that those calves have had plenty of time to develop immunity to the things that they might get exposed to. So a good nutrition program is based around the resources that are available to your farm. So I often tell people whenever I get a phone call about, well, what can I feed my cows or what can I feed my cattle, that it really depends on what kind of base you're working with. And I know we've got folks from all over the country tuned into this call, so those forage resources might be different, but we want to make sure that preconditioning program is based around those. So working closely with your veterinarian to implement a proper vaccination schedule is something that I think is really important. And I probably should have asked this before we started this call, but a lot of feed yards now will require a certain set of vaccines. So for example, if they've seen some issues with Pasteurella or Hesophilus here recently, they might require that added vaccination be added to those animals before they can get to the feed yard. A lot of times when we're commingling a group of cattle, particularly for something like this, having those stringent vaccination programs in place and making sure that everybody follows that and gives them enough time is something that's really key. So when those cattle get together, they're often bringing along their germs with them. So those cattle on your farm might have been exposed to those germs and they might have immunity to them, but those bacteria and those viruses that they carry with them might infect their pen mate. So we want to make sure that we're keeping, even though we care about how our cattle are performing, they're in a group with other cattle, so we want to make sure they're staying healthy with that rest of that group. So when we're thinking about a preconditioning program in terms of what can I feed those animals, not all feeds are created equally for a preconditioning program. They have different nutrient values, different rates of fermentation. So Chip did a good job, I think, of walking y'all through the step-up diet program once those cattle got to the feed yard. And part of the reason that we do that is we don't want to introduce those cattle to a glut of grain really quickly, because that's something that's going to ferment really fast and could lead to some problems with acidosis. So a lot of times a preconditioning program will focus on low starch, highly digestible fiber feeds to get those cattle, that animal's rumen working and function, get those bugs used to digesting those things before they get to the feed yard. So feed delivery is something that's important not only during the backgrounding period, but also there at the feed yard. There's a reason why we feed 3 times a day whenever we're getting those cattle started on feed at the feed yard. We want to make sure those cattle that are timid are coming up to the bunk and there's feed available at all times. So we're not forcing those cattle to clean up immediately, and we're being consistent at the times that we're going to provide feed. So when we're talking about receiving diets, we want to consider a lot of those things that we talked about. You know, those cattle are under stressed. A lot of times, if they were hauled somewhere to get to that backgrounding period, they might have been deprived of water. They might be deprived of shrink. We need to consider what their previous nutrition program was. And then in terms of intake, we need to take into account when we first put them in that preconditioning pen, those calves are going to be pretty low in terms of the feed that they consume. So during that first 1 week period, we want to have them on something that's a little bit higher in terms of crude protein. And then as we get farther along, we can start decreasing the protein a little bit because that's our most expensive nutrient. And there's a reason if you were to look at those feed yard diets, they're not in that 18% protein range because it's expensive for us to use protein to add fat to those animals. And that's our goal whenever we get to the feed yard. So reaching target gains, if we're basing this around the forage program, and we want our cattle to kind of be in a holding phase. So here in the southeast, we focus a lot on grazing ryegrass. So after the first of the year, or even now in some parts of the South Mississippi or closer to the Gulf Coast, they're turning those cattle after they've been weaned on the ryegrass, and they're getting a lot more nutrients and they're able to take off and thrive. So if we want those cattle to gain more and be bigger when they get to the feed yard, we're going to have to provide them more nutrients during the backgrounding phase. So I talked a little bit about why processing and treatments are so important. So designing that vaccination program with your veterinarian, working closely with them is something that's key. That animal does not develop immunity as soon as we give them the shot of that vaccine. And I think that's something that's important to remember, is we have to give that vaccine time to work. So it'll create an immune response in that animal. And then when that animal is exposed to that pathogen again, then that animal's immune system will be prepared to respond and fight off that pathogen. But if that animal has not had the chance to develop immunity, or it's exposed to something that it's never seen before, be it from something it's seen in the environment or from a vaccination program, that animal is the one that's more likely to get sick. So it's important that we practice proper vaccine handling to give these vaccines every chance that they can to work whenever they get in that animal. So once that vaccine is purchased, it's kept in a cooler or on ice or on cool packs if we order it in the mail. Keep it in a cooler even when we're working those animals out the chute side. Safeguard those vaccines to make sure that they stay effective. If we're using a modified live virus, which we know research has shown we get a better immune response from a modified live virus, we should only mix up what we would use in 2 hours. One thing to think about with using a modified live virus is if we're using a multi-dose syringe, we don't want to disinfect that needle between animals because we'd be killing that modified live virus. So a little bit something to think about there. So practicing proper injection site management is something that's really important. So using proper restraint and facilities if we're treating with an antibiotic, no more than 10 cc's per site. If it's a smaller animal, we want to make sure it gets less. We want to give injections at least 4 inches apart, and all injections should be given in front of the shoulder. So what I'm talking about here is kind of the hallmark of the Beef Quality Assurance Program. So our BQA guidelines require that all injections are given in the neck region. If we have a choice, we want those injections to be subcutaneously, so under the skin versus in the muscle. And this is the reason why. So we want to avoid injection site damage. So anytime we inject something in the muscle, it decreases meat quality and tenderness, and it can cause an injection site lesion. So this is really a big problem for folks that might be synchronizing an animal and she doesn't get bred, so I'm just going to injector wherever is close by, and that might be the rump area as she goes by. If that cow gets harvested because she doesn't get pregnant, we have a very good chance that that cow might have an injection site lesion. Choose to use subcutaneous administration whenever possible, whenever we're given these vaccines and antibiotics. Keep it clean and in working order. Use sharp needles, proper needle size, and proper length. So if we're talking about a subcutaneous injection, a shorter length is better because it's less likely to go into the muscle. And this one I think that is really important and is really key. So when you're working with your veterinarian to develop that good herd health protocol is make sure you're reading the labels. So a vaccine might be a one shot and you're done, or it might recommend that you give a booster shot 2 to 4 weeks later. So that booster shot will provide kind of an added boost in that animal's immune response. So it's seeing that pathogen, and then we introduce it again, so it's even more prepared to fight that pathogen when it should see it out in the real world. So I know I've touched on a good bit of things, and I guess should have started with this slide kind of as we were going through, but I wanted to kind of give y'all a little bit of introduction via pictures of myself. I guess I'm dating myself because there's a date on that backdrop of those pictures. So that top picture in the left is the one that y'all saw in your newsletter. So that's actually a group of cattle that we had on a research project here at Mississippi State. So we were looking at some different deworming practices. We've looked at some different nutrition strategies. We have looked at deworming practices, nutrition strategies, vaccination protocols, you name it. If it involves kind of that background and phase and getting cattle prepared for the feed yard, that's something that's really important to us research-wise. I also am in charge of what goes on at our university beef unit. So our commercial herd consists of Sim-Angus HT cattle. So some of y'all that are not familiar with those, essentially we're running a Cimbro bull on Angus cows in our scenario, but that's not the only way that you can make those. So there's Sim-Angus with a little bit of Brahman influence, which makes them a little bit more heat tolerant for the environment here in Mississippi. So we actually just started the second set of those cattle on feed there in Iowa. So we've been plenty pleased with following those cattle through the feed yard, getting our results and our performance. Those cattle are doing really well, and that's one of the goals for our program. And that's one thing that I think is so important, and I'm so proud of y'all for being involved in this deer profitability competition. Even if this is your first introduction to retaining ownership and feeding out your own cattle, you'll get so much valuable information that you can take back to your herd and improve things. There in the middle is a picture of my family and our farm logo. So my husband and I and our little boy Mason have MBK cattle here in Starkville. So on top of things that I do at the university, we've also got our own cow herd, mostly purebred Simmies, handful of Sim-Angus as well. And we've actually got some with a little bit of Beefmaster influence too. So we've got a little bit of Brahman influence in these cattle. So I just wanted y'all to know that I guess the reason I put that in there is I've been in your shoes as well, especially if you look at those pictures down there on the bottom. So 2005 was the last year that I participated in the National Classic. And I put those up there just to kind of as a reminder of what you can get out of this program. So the picture on the left-hand side of the screen was the top 20 overall seniors in that last competition. So unfortunately, I was not the winner. I was 5th overall. But as I look in that picture, we may have aged a little bit in the last 12 years. It's been a long time. We may have aged a little bit in the last 12 years, but as I look through that picture, I see a lot of folks that are industry leaders, that are also like me and are professors at universities. I see a couple of veterinarians. I see some pharmaceutical salesmen. I see some insurance salesmen. I see someone that works on the marketing side and photography side in the beef industry. And a lot of those folks are ones that are kind of stepping up to the plate to be the next generation of Simmental breeders. And I think that's one thing that I really love about our junior program, is the folks that I've gotten to meet along the way, and the fact that we're still so connected. So vast majority, I think just about everyone in that top 20 from that last National Classic that I did, is still breeding and still raising, still producing Simmental cattle. So I think that's something that's pretty cool. The picture on the right-hand side was what we called our dream team. So I grew up in Louisiana, and there were not many from Louisiana that made the trip every summer to Junior Nationals. So we had the opportunity that year to pick our own teams and not necessarily be on teams from our state. So I'm there in the white pants from Louisiana. Megan Favorite there next to me in the yellow skirt was from Tennessee. Jay Thiessen from Minnesota, and Ashley Moore, now Warren, from Kentucky. So we had an awesome run at that team competition. And those are folks that I still see and enjoy, starting their own families. So it's really exciting that many of us in that top 20 picture are going to have kids that are all going to be involved in the junior program at the same time. So I feel like I've babbled on for long enough, and we're getting close to 8 o'clock Central Time. So I will open the floor up for questions. If anybody has any questions for me, if y'all want to put them in the chat box, I can respond to them there. While you're thinking about those, or if you're watching this after the fact, I apologize. I think I have my contact information on the next slide. So if you would like to get a hold of me, if you have any questions after the fact, if you're watching this recording and working on your report, feel free to email me. My email address down there at the bottom of the page. My office number there as well. So I will give y'all a few minutes, and if nobody has any questions.
Brandi, this is Chip. I have a question on my side. Could I throw at you?
Sure.
Great. So since you're very familiar with studying and looking through GoSafe data, and especially in some of your efforts at looking at cattle with ill health of one sort or another, describe the process of what a youngster might see if they were watching a cat. What happens to the appetite over a period of a time of a calf who goes through a pretty serious health challenge but recovers? Kind of describe what's happening as you're looking at intakes, conversions, and the like.
Sure. So probably one of the first things that we'll see and why this GrowSafe system is so valuable is those calves will start going off with feed. So our intakes will start declining. And if you remember, whenever I talked about nutrient requirements there, their gain is tied directly to their nutrient intake. So if those cattle are not consuming feed, they might not be coughing, they might not have a runny nose, but they're just kind of slowly starting to back off feed and not quite eating as much. We're going to start seeing gains decrease. So that's one of the key things. Now, if those cattle aren't in a GrowSafe facility, we train our students to look for things like depression. So that calf that's kind of hanging off in the back of the pen by himself, just kind of got his head down. We might hear a little cough every now and then. You know, as we get to more extreme cases, we probably see a lot of mucus coming out of their nose and things from there. So I mentioned that decreased gain that we see there. We'll also start seeing some poor conversion ratios. So if you think about it, that animal is directing all of that energy that they're consuming to its immune system so it can fight off that pathogen that it's exposed to. So if the nutrients that that animal is consuming are going towards fighting off a disease, then they're not going towards adding gain, or if particularly we're towards the end of the feedlot phase, adding fat and getting ready to harvest. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Chip?
Spot on. And then I'm going to throw one more thing while chats and questions might be coming your way. You interestingly described a convergence of things that are key to a tool that I introduced to the youngsters in our last webinar. Actually gave them at least a little bit of insight into what their calves scores would be through our new feeder profit calculator.
Sure.
And it's interesting that you talked about two pieces that are fundamental besides the known genetics which these young cattle feeders provide. But the other piece is that cattle need to be weaned and preconditioned a certain period of time, minimally 30 days, and they need to be doubly vaccinated for BRD. So I bring all that up as to kind of preface the following question. What do you see the picture looking like in our industry over the next 10 to 20 years, which will be the formative, some of the early career aspects of some of the people on this phone call? How do you see the industry trending with those things? Do you see any chance that we back up on some of those efforts? We're going to continue to double down. Are they going to go even farther? What's your professional opinion? Tell us what we're doing there.
So I think going forward, especially with some of the I want to say pushback or some of the signals that we're getting from consumers. So a big key thing is decreased antibiotic use. We've seen it with the veterinary feed directive. We've seen some regulations coming down the pipeline. And, we see a lot of consumers that when they're buying something, they want to see a no antibiotics ever label. And the way we get to that point is using good management strategies, having those cattle weaned, immunized, backgrounded for a certain period of time, so we're preparing those cattle to thrive. And I think that's something, especially in the coming years, as the consumer is taking more and more of an interest in their food source and where food is coming from, that we're going to continue to see those things. And I think that it might not necessarily be that we're always going to get a premium for these things like we're seeing now, but it might start being the opposite direction. So those cattle are going to be the standard as we start seeing more and more adoption of these practices. And those cattle that are coming, straight to the sale, straight off the cow, still balling, never seen any type of management in their life, those are going to start seeing some pretty severe discounts when we start talking about things in terms of dollars and cents. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of changing practices, is getting down there to dollars and cents.
Makes perfect sense. I think many of us would completely agree with that. Kelsey, Jackie, are we seeing any chats or questions come your way?
Yes, I have a question from two participants. The first question is, what if we see all of the vaccine, or what if we do all the vaccines that are suggested and still have problems with our calves getting sick after weaning?
Sure. So that's a common question that gets asked a lot. So I vaccinated, I followed all of these practices, but my calf still got sick. What did I do wrong? And that's the situation where, number one, maybe that calf didn't develop as well of an immune response as their peers. So that's kind of a delicate thing. So each animal's immune system is a little bit different in terms of how they develop an immune response. The other thing might be is we vaccinated, we developed immunity to everything that was in those vaccines, and then those calves got exposed to something out in left field that we didn't expect we'd need to vaccinate those calves for. So that's one of the things where when I emphasize working closely with that feed yard veterinarian that you're sending those cattle to that yard, or your local veterinarian, a lot of times if you're sending those cattle to a feed yard, they might say, well, this time of year we're seeing a lot of problems with Mannheimia, so we recommend tacking this on in terms of your vaccination program. So that's something that I think is really important. I would not be discouraged by that. So nothing is guaranteed to be 100% effective as much as we would like it to be. So there's probably always going to be those handful of cattle that even if we do everything quote unquote right, y'all not being able to see me and all of my hand motions makes it a little bit difficult for me sometimes. So without doing everything right, sometimes those cattle are just kind of set up to fail, and that's why we keep doing research in this area to see what else can we do to keep these cattle going right and going forward.
Thank you, Brandi. And my next question from a participant is, do you think the length of hauling a calf affects their performance at the feedlot, as some of the calves have come from much longer and farther distances than others?
Yep, I mean, I think that's definitely true. You know, we've recently, I mentioned, we're assembling these cattle for our research projects, and we've actually been tracking how far they're traveling from a sale barn to our farm. And those cattle that are traveling over a certain distance are going to see more problems with shrink. So the longer those cattle are hauled, we might get into instances where it's not just fill shrink, they're starting to lose some tissue shrink, and that's just simply going to take longer for those cattle to recover. So that's one of the reasons why when those cattle get to the yard, that we give them a period of time to rest. Those cattle that are hauled from 20 miles down the road, they're going to bounce back a lot of times a lot quicker than those cattle that are hauled from 500 miles down the road. So those are some things that, you know, these cattle are not just on feed for a 30-day period when we send them to the feed yard. So those are some things that those cattle, you know, might not gain as much to start off with, but then they might hit their stride there towards the end and get caught up pretty quickly. You know, it's a long way from Starkville, Mississippi to the southwest corner of Iowa, where we're shipping these cattle to that feed yard we're using for research purposes. And those cattle are still performing well. So a lot of it, I think, has to do with distance, but a lot of it also has to do with genetics too. So if those cattle are predisposed to have a lot more genetics for gain and growth, we're going to see that a lot more in those cattle.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that I am seeing on my end.
Sure. Well, I sure want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight, and I really want to thank the staff there at the ASA for inviting me to be a part of this. I think this is something that's really exciting. I kind of wish that I would have had a chance to be involved with it back in the day whenever I was a junior member as well.
Well, Dr. Karisch, we say thank you a bunch. We couldn't be more pleased to have you or more proud to have a fellow civic person on here helping educate us. So thank you to all the exhibitors and the participants tonight. If you have questions or comments for Dr. Karisch, obviously she told you how to catch up with her. Same with us for staff. You should be seeing your monthly bills go out in mere days, but you can go ahead and get a feel for what those are going to be if you look through that CAP data. So with that said, Jackie, Kelsey, any last comments on your side? Otherwise, we'll let these good folks have their evening. I will take that as a no. Ladies and gentlemen, good night and thank you.
All right, thank you.